Now we're going to discuss the geographical range that we find with Homo erectus. And so, as we've already noted, Homo erectus was the first fossil hominin to leave Africa and really to extend its range into more temperate areas and areas characterized by a higher degree of environmental adversity. So, the first fossils appear in Africa around 1.7 million years ago in East Turkana, Kenya. And additional sites in Africa have fossils that date to not too long after that fact. We have the simultaneous appearance of Homo erectus fossils or fossils that are very similar in Atapuerca, Spain by about 1.8 million years ago, and on the island of Java by about 1.6 million years ago. So, what this indicates is that the divergence or the branching that gives rise to Homo erectus likely predates these time periods, probably somewhere between about 3 and 2 million years ago. And this informs how we view even like Homo habilis. This informs even how we view specimens like Homo habilis. You know, we had this contemporary, or this historical view, sorry, that Homo habilis was ancestral to Homo erectus, was ancestral to anatomically modern Homo sapiens. And now we realize that a more likely scenario was that Australopiths individually diverged into both Homo erectus and Homo habilis sometime between about 3 and 2 million years ago. All right, so in Africa, we see specimens of Homo erectus that date to about 1.7 to 1 million years ago. They've got a cranial capacity that's in the lower ranges, about 848 cubic centimeters. They do have this characteristic vaulting shape to their cranium that is associated with this larger brain size and increasing encephalization. There are some later specimens in the Olduvai Gorge that have robust skull bases, a larger cranial capacity, closer to about 1,067 cubic centimeters, massive brow ridges and thin cranial walls. So we see a bit of diversity even within Africa in terms of kind of this mix of derived and archaic features. One interesting find that's relatively recent is that of a female pelvis, almost complete female pelvis, that was found in Ethiopia. And the reason the female pelvis is important for us is because it gives us some insight into how Homo erectus was growing their large brain. I mean, we recognize this overall increase in brain size. We recognize this overall increase in encephalization. But the how of it, there's two ways you can grow a larger brain. One, you can be born with a larger brain. And two, you can spend more time then developing and growing a larger brain. So that postnatal growth. And so the female pelvis helps to inform our conclusions regarding this, because if we're going to give birth to larger brained infants, we need to have a wider birth canal. And what we find with this relatively complete female pelvis is that the birth canal was wider. This indicates a growth of larger brained infants, or the birth of larger brained infants. But we also kind of note overall from the pace of development that we see across all of the Homo erectus fossils that we have, that there was also a period of postnatal brain growth. And so this informs kind of how long this period of juvenile dependency is, and helps to inform some certain life history traits. One of the characteristic differences we see between anatomically modern humans and other species of living primate is that other species of living primates have the juvenile phase, which is when they're not fully grown in terms of body size. They're not sexually mature, but they are self-feeding. What's different about modern humans is that we have a life history stage we call childhood. The difference between the juvenile period and childhood hinges on this component of self-feeding. I mean, our toddlers certainly, quote unquote, feed themselves in the sense that they physically put the food in their own mouths, but they don't produce the calories that they consume. And so they are being provisioned for a much longer period of time by their parents, by their grandparents, etc. And so we are interested in answering kind of when these more modern life histories emerge. And what this pelvis shows us is that childhood, at least, it seems that we share with Homo erectus, that the early parts of their childhood were spent devoting time and energy towards postnatal brain growth and development, and that this corresponds, particularly when coupled with a dietary niche that's focusing on hunted game, this is going to correspond with parental provisioning. And so we can say that Homo erectus had childhood. What we can't say yet is whether Homo erectus also had this distinctive adolescent phase. And that's part of what the debate with Turkana is about. If there's going to be a massive adolescent growth spurt, like what we see with modern human males, we're going to need provisioning as well during that period, because they're not going to be able to produce enough calories to sustain that massive pace of growth. So our best guess right now is that childhood emerges with Homo erectus, but adolescence may not emerge until archaic Homo sapiens like Neanderthals and Denisovans. All right, anyway, so when we examine all of the Homo erectus fossils through a cladistic lens, really looking at those derived characteristics, what cladistics shows us is that there's meaningful regional variation of a polytypic species, that that splitting these into Homo ergaster versus Homo heidelbergensis versus Homo erectus is probably not the most appropriate way to go. Cladistically, these just are regional degrees of variation within the same species. All right, so Dmanisi, Georgia is one of these areas with early appearance. We see fossils in Georgia that date to about 1.8 million years, so about the same time scale as these early Homo erectus fossils from Africa. In Georgia, the crania are more similar to the Homo erectus in Africa, but less robust. We don't have that same kind of thickening around the base, or not to the same degree that we see with Homo erectus in Africa. They've got a lower face that's more projecting, so a more prognathous kind of jaw. Large upper canine still. We haven't seen the full reduction of that upper canine, and a smaller brain case. Their skeletal proportions are very similar to modern humans. So what this demonstrates is that the energetic efficiency that comes with bipedality would have certainly played a role in the expansion of Homo erectus outside of Africa. That because we were able to save calories, we were able to travel farther distances. This is going to be critical with respect to developing hunting as a subsistence strategy. Also critical for mapping out these patterns of migration. We see smaller stature in the Dmanisi fossils. So they range from about 4'9" to maybe like 5 feet, 5'1" or 2. We also, these earliest Dmanisi fossils use Oldowan style tools. We have not yet seen this technological innovation that comes with the Acheulean traditions of later Homo erectus. In Indonesia, we have a fossil, Java man, that dates from eastern Java to about 1.6 to 1 million years old. You can see that the brow ridge is not quite as robust. We've got this little bit of a retention of what we call a sagittal keel. In China, we also have some early Homo erectus fossils that date to about 780,000 years ago in the Zhoukoudian cave. We've got 14 skull caps, more than 100 isolated teeth that belong to roughly 40 adults and children. These features on these Jakutian fossils include a large brow ridge, pronounced nucleatorus, thick bones in the skull, the retention of the sagittal keel, and a protruding face. We also find extensive material remains in the Jakutian cave. So we've got more than 1,000 cultural remains, including tools of all sorts. We've got choppers, and really, one of the things that comes out of this bulk of material remains is demonstrating these technological shifts that come with the Acheulean tradition. Acheulean tools are different from Oldowan tools in the fact that we have a characteristic retouching of the core into what we call a biface that has two retouch sides, which makes something that's sharper, that's got more of a point, that's got a larger cutting edge. And so we see these choppers and scrapers. We also see burins, awls, and points. We see evidence of woodworking, of fashioning clothing, etc. What we what we conclude from these populations in China is that they used fire, and they had a broader diet. They hunted deer, but they also spent time gathering herbs, fruits, tubers, and eggs. So by broadening their diet, they're getting a more consistent protein and fat base. And having a more consistent supply of both protein and fat is going to tie directly to increases in brain size, because your brains are made up predominantly of phospholipids, which are fat particles. You have to have fat to be able to grow these large brains, and that's one reason why, if you've ever fed infants, the formula companies are now putting things like DHEA, omega-3 fatty acids into baby formula, because that's something that mothers are able to transmit to their infants through breastfeeding that formula was kind of falling short on. We, with this brain growth, require diets that are really high in fat at young ages, so that we can grow these energetically costly brains. In Europe, we've got two sites. We've got the Atapuerca Mountains of Spain, and we've got the Soprano site in Italy. The Atapuerca Mountains date to about 1.2 million years ago. We've only got one specimen with a partial jaw and a few teeth. The preliminary analyses place this specimen close to the Dominici fossils, so an early Erectus. But the fragmentary nature of the specimens makes taxonomic assignment problematic. Spanish paleoanthropologists dubbed this population Homo antecessor. When we find more remains, we'll be able to get a clearer picture of how they fit in with respect to the regional variation that we see within Homo erectus. Similarly, in the Soprano site in Italy, these date to between about 900,000 or 800,000 years ago, maybe to as recently as 450,000 years ago. And there was a tendency to classify these as a separate designation, separate taxonomic designation. But again, we need to have more remains found, more fossils found to be able to make these clear taxonomic assignments. One thing that we see with Homo erectus that we've already mentioned is this increasing technological or ecological intensification. This large body and large brain size of Homo erectus requires more energy and thus requires more food. So to be able to support both a larger body size and then increased encephalization, you've got to have more consistent access specifically to meat, specifically to protein and fat. So Homo erectus is often reconstructed as occupying an intensified ecological niche. What this means is that Homo erectus interacted more intensively with their environment. And so that included then active hunting relative to the scavenging that we saw with Homo habilis and gracile australopiths. These larger bodies and longer limbs, because Homo erectus has limbs that are more in proportion with modern populations, increase locomotor efficiency. So when we talk about the efficiency of bipedal locomotion, as our skeletons become more modern, we are able to to move farther distances with a lower kind of caloric or metabolic burden. This means we can cover more ground on a day-to-day basis through walking or running than smaller hominins, and we've got this lower energy cost. The other thing that we have to talk about with respect to the emergence of hunting and how humans hunt. Humans hunt basically through outlasting, through endurance, through stalking their prey until their prey gives up with exhaustion. So um, we pursue prey, yes, but we don't do so fast. We're basically just long distance walkers. We can walk forever and ever and expend very little energy. The larger brain size that we see in Homo erectus gives these hominins better capacities for processing complex ecological information across the more expansive terrain. So we're better off at mapping things, both temporally and spatially. We are also better at accessing things that are embedded either in substrate or, that require pursuit and handling. So we see like smarter, better pursuit of prey, which increases our meat consumption. We also see higher efficiency at getting materials out of embedded substrate. So being able to go after these roots and tubers, for example. We also, with the innovation of fire, dramatically bump up the bioavailability of the nutrients that we consume, because controlling and then cooking our food gives us an incredible advantage. It starts to pre-digest the food before it ever hits our stomachs, which means that absorption can happen not only in the intestines but also in the stomach. So we don't have to have changes to our gastrointestinal tract, for example, to be able to cope with this changing diet. We cope with this changing diet through technological means, through cooking our food, through processing our food. So this changes our energy budget even more, so that we've got more calories at our disposal while simultaneously using fewer calories. So this is going to have a couple of implications. One, this frees up over the course of Homo erectus's tenure on this planet, frees up more calories to devote towards brain growth and brain development. And we see this reflected in these Homo erectus fossils. Our brains get larger. We become increasingly encephalized over the course of Homo erectus evolution. It wasn't like a one-time and done kind of thing. This also allows us to decrease our metabolic burden of pregnancy. So we're able to translate then more calories into more babies, which is going to be associated with being an expansionist species. This is going to be associated with being on the move, emigrating into new habitats, new territories, and kind of getting a secure foothold there. So part of the expansion of the species of Homo erectus was enabled through greater kind of fertility, through having more babies, through greater reproductive output, because this increases our population sizes, and then the need for people to move into new areas. All right, so we also see clear evidence of Homo erectus accessing medium and large size animal carcasses for meat through both hunting and scavenging. They wouldn't give up a scavenging opportunity, but then when scavenging opportunities were not available, they were able to actively hunt meat. We see fossil remains of animals with cut marks left by butchery. We see this transition from what we call the head and hoof faunal assemblages of earlier members of the genus Homo and the gracile Australopiths to us being associated with the femur. So we're getting more prime cuts of meat. This behavior, in terms of regularly accessing animal carcasses, is an ecological change from earlier hominins. This is incredibly significant. Now, we have a history in anthropology of kind of treating human evolution as, man the hunter. Oh, let's beat our chests and grunt like Grok would have on, the African savannah living in caves or whatever. This isn't an entirely accurate view. Now, meat is a critical resource that humans are very motivated to eat, that humans were very motivated to acquire, that people are quick to profess that that's what they desire when they're hungry. But what this doesn't mean is that males were the only ones making significant contributions to the diets. Part of the reason we're able to have childhood instead of the juvenile period is because precisely because males are contributing to the diet. We're able to sustain longer periods of investment and also basically what we call stacking babies. We're able to have multiple offspring of various ages that are dependent upon us all at the same time, precisely because males are going after hunted game, and the hunted game is calorically valuable. What this doesn't negate, though, are the consistent carbohydrate offerings that come through women's work. And so, going after hunted game is a risky strategy. We don't hunt like other predators. We don't go after the weak and the injured. We go after prime-aged individuals. We hunt in a way that kind of maximizes our hunting returns over the long term because we're able to kind of selectively cull the population. In many populations, males are in excess. If we're hunting prime-aged adult males, we can hunt more animals without negatively affecting birth rates and overall population size. So, but pursuing this risky strategy comes at a cost, right? Anything that has a probabilistic nature of encountering means that some days you're going to be successful, some days you're not, some days you're going to strike out, and that's where the importance of women's work comes in, is that women were providing consistent carbohydrate calories so that even when men struck out, they were able to still feed everybody that night. So, what evolved isn't man the hunter per se, but rather is pair bonding and biparental care. The fact that we, by stacking our babies, by having multiple dependent young that we take care of for very long periods of time, we're favoring long-term pair bonding and paternal investment. We're favoring kind of an equal investment of males to the well-being of children that we expect from females. The earliest Homo erectus specimens are found associated with Oldowan tools. These Oldowan tools are very similar to what Homo habilis was using, what the Gracile Australopiths were using. By 1.5 million years ago, populations of Homo erectus were creating a brand new tool type. This was called this industry is called the Acheulean industry, and it's characterized by a core that's been worked on both sides, kind of relative to the one side that we work in the production of Oldowan tools. So this is called a biface. It gives us a flatter face. The image that you see pictured is basically the Acheulean Swiss Army knife, kind of a multi-purpose point that can cut through hide, that can also scrape meat and connective tissue off bone, that is useful in allowing us more reliable access to game. So this last thing that we need to talk about are some of these unanswered questions about Homo erectus. There are two significant questions about Homo erectus, one of which focuses on the degree to which they were sexually dimorphic, and the other which focuses on whether or not they had language. So we'll start with sexual dimorphism. Sexual dimorphism is simply defined as the difference in the expression of phenotypes between males and females. So basically it's physical differences between males and females, and what we use most commonly across biology is body size. That in species that are sexually dimorphic, more often than not, males are going to be larger than females. This is also related to the breeding system. If males are monopolizing multiple females and are competing to exclude other males' access to those females, that can be associated with an increase in male body size. Think about gorillas. Males relative to females. So sexual dimorphism in body size is prevalent across a lot of primates. And 2 out of the 4 great apes have a pretty large degree of body size sexual dimorphism. So it's an indicator of reproductive strategies, group dynamics. It can also be a confounding factor when we're trying to assign taxonomic designations. And so particularly as we're looking at intraspecific variation, if all of the specimens that we find in one locale are male and all the specimens that we find in another locale are female, we can completely miss the fact that we're talking about a larger degree of sexual dimorphism in body size and perhaps assign those two populations to different taxonomic designations. So this large amount of size variation that we see across Homo erectus, that's taken predominantly from fragmentary fossil remains, makes it difficult to estimate average levels of dimorphism. So some of these can be temporal trends, right? Like the Dominici fossils are smaller than fossils in Africa, like Turkana and this can be due in part to the fact that maybe they're slightly earlier and we're seeing temporal trends, increases in heights. We call those secular trends in like population demography. Or it can be a situation where these vastly different sizes really reflect vastly different patterns of investment in body size across males and females. So the Homo erectus fossil record provides us clear evidence of a large range of skeletal size variation that's at least equivalent to what we see in modern human populations. I mean, if we were to juxtapose the Inuit and the Maasai, for example, the Inuit with an average adult male height of about 5'4", the Maasai with an average adult male height of roughly 6'4". We might not, given, let's say, human remains, we might not classify those as even the same species. Think about dog breeds as well, Chihuahuas versus Great Danes, right? We see a large degree of variability that is not indicative of different taxonomic designations. But it doesn't provide this body of dimorphism that we see in our fragmentary remains doesn't provide conclusive evidence that males were systematically larger to the great extent that they are today. So we don't exactly know what the, let's say, average level of dimorphism was among Homo erectus. If Homo erectus did have more sexual dimorphism than modern Homo sapiens, then we might be able to make some inferences about their mating systems. For example, we would infer that male-male competition for mates was more dependent on body size than it is today. In today's kind of ecology, including our cultural ecology, competition for mates has more to do with provisioning and kind of earning capacity than it does with just overall absolute body size, unless you're looking for mates for protection. So, in crime-ridden areas, for example, women also often are at more of a risk for domestic violence, specifically because they're choosing males that display or advertise high levels of violence, and so that translates into more violence even being taken out on the female, and when really what's at the root is this overall level of competition among males in terms of access to mates. So some of our conclusions and then the inferences that we make are going to be dependent upon finding a larger body of evidence. The second, and this relates to kind of how we define humanity. Language is considered to be one of the hallmark traits of humanity, but can be difficult to assess from the fossil record. We do have some features of morphology that are associated with language, like having the hyoid bone that our vocal cords are able to connect to. We have other features, though, that are brain structures, and we can see things like overall changes in cranial capacity, the volume that's available for the brain to fill. But that doesn't necessarily give us a lot of information about the functional specialization of certain regions in the brain. So, for example, our modern speech is associated with modern mutations that give us the human form of what's called the FOXP2 gene. The FOXP2 gene doesn't actually control speech. What it controls instead are fine motor movements of the tongue. This is associated with being able to enunciate, with being able to make very distinct changes in your inflection and how you pronounce your words, which can then be associated with changes in meaning of the words. When we think about inflection in our language, it's the difference of that's what you're wearing today versus that's what you're wearing today versus that's what you're wearing today, right? We can talk about that lilt at the end that then conveys that we're asking more of a question, like, are you sure that's really what you want to wear today? There are some languages, Mandarin being one of these, that merely changing the inflection of a phrase changes its entire meaning. So, we can see some really big changes in the message that we're communicating based on how we're pronouncing the words that we actually say. Thus far, there have been no definitive anatomical findings that cause us to reject the idea that Homo erectus would be capable of at least a rudimentary spoken language. We've tried looking at the history of genes that are associated with linguistic capabilities, like that FOXP2 gene. The recovery of some ancient genetic sequences of Neanderthals and Denisovans has provided light into the genetic history of language production. The human FOXP2 gene, for example, does date back to Neanderthals and Denisovans, indicating that maybe its emergence or that original mutation even predates Neanderthals and Denisovans. So, if Neanderthals and Denisovans were able to have language because of that FOXP2 gene, we might see rudimentary language present in even Homo erectus. So we don't know whether they had language or not. Arguably, we could say they had some form of communication system that had a fair degree of complexity. I mean, you can't coordinate large-scale cooperative efforts like boat building and migration and hunting of game without being able to communicate clear messages that carry meaning with them. So what their language would have sounded like, we have no idea. It wouldn't have been as complex as modern human linguistic variation, but we also don't have any evidence to reject the idea that Neanderthals had or didn't have language. So in summary, Homo erectus, not Neanderthals, sorry, Homo erectus. Homo erectus fossils have been found in Africa, Europe, and Asia, dating from about 1.8 million to about 100,000 years ago, probably even into the late Pleistocene. So they live for overall more than 1.5 million years. They've likely first appeared in East Africa and then migrated to other areas. They were a widespread and successful hominin with a new and modern pattern of human evolution, that is, this habitual bipedal locomotion to stalk your prey to death, basically. Homo erectus differs from other members of the genus Homo with its larger brain, taller stature, robust build, and changes in facial structuring, such as cranial buttressing. Homo erectus and their contemporaries influenced or introduced a more sophisticated tool tradition called the Acheulean tradition, and likely ate novel foods that were processed in new ways, including meat as a major source of protein. And then lastly, Homo erectus, through its new tools and its new ecological niche, was able to push into new environments and culturally cope with environmental adversity. This ability to adapt to environmental adversity through cultural means is going to become increasingly important with our next bit of material, which will be archaic Homo sapiens and the appearance of anatomically modern Homo sapiens. So, we see the first quote-unquote cultural ape, cultural hominin, let's say, emerge with Homo erectus, but we're going to see that increasing reliance on technology or culture to cope with things ramp up from here until the appearance of anatomically modern Homo sapiens.